The night was colder than usual, the kind that seemed to silence even the restless hum of New York City. Billionaire Edward Kingston sat alone behind the wheel of his sleek black Rolls-Royce, the headlights slicing through mist as he drove aimlessly through the dim backstreets behind his mansion. He wasn't supposed to be there. Men of his kind never were. But something had been gnawing at him lately. An emptiness success couldn't fill that as the car purred to a stop at the corner of an alley. Edward noticed movement near a row of trash bins. At first, he assumed it was a stray animal rummaging for scraps. But then a faint voice carried through the quiet air. "Please, God, just something for my son." Edward frowned, leaning forward. The voice was human. Female. Trembling that he stepped out of the car, the cold air biting through his tailored suit. The streetlight above flickered weakly, throwing long, broken shadows across the cracked pavement. He walked closer, his polished shoes splashing through puddles. Then, under that dim, trembling light, he saw her, and his heart stilled that it was Maria, his maid. She was kneeling beside a trash bin, her uniform wrinkled and damp, her hands shaking as she pulled out a half-eaten sandwich wrapped in greasy paper. Her eyes darted around nervously, and before Edward could say a word, she lifted the sandwich to her lips, hesitating, then took a small, desperate bite. For a long moment, Edward couldn't move. The image before him didn't make sense. Maria, the quiet, disciplined woman who scrubbed his marble floors and polished his silverware, was eating from the garbage. The surge of emotions hit him all at once. Disbelief, anger, pity. "Maria," he said finally, his deep voice cutting through the silence. She froze. The sandwich slipped from her hands, landing with a dull thud on the pavement. Slowly, she turned toward him, her face pale and wet with tears. "Sir, I didn't see you," she stammered, stepping back, her body trembling. Edward's brows furrowed. "What on earth are you doing?" he demanded, his tone sharp though his heart was heavy. "You work in a mansion with a full kitchen. Why are you eating from the trash?" Maria's lips quivered. "Please, sir, it's not what it looks like." But Edward couldn't listen, not yet. His mind raced with questions. Was she stealing food? Had she fallen into addiction? He didn't know what to think. All he could see was one of his own employees, a woman under his roof, eating from garbage like she had no other choice. That he stepped closer, his voice low but stern. "If you needed food, you could have asked. You didn't have to do this." Maria's eyes welled up even more. "I'm sorry, sir. I'm so sorry." The words hung heavy between them. Edward stood there, torn between fury and sorrow. In his world of luxury, this was unimaginable. A billionaire finding his maid eating leftovers from the trash. It felt like something out of a cruel dream. Finally, he took a step back, his voice colder than he meant it to be. "You'll explain this tomorrow, Maria. I expect you at the mansion first thing in the morning." He turned away, unable to bear the sight any longer. As he walked back to his car, he heard her sob quietly behind him. The sound of humiliation, desperation, and something deeper he couldn't yet name. Edward drove off, but his reflection in the rearview mirror wouldn't let him forget. The image of her trembling hands, the broken whisper for her son, and the look of shame on her face clung to him like a ghost. That night, for the first time in years, the billionaire's mansion didn't feel like home. It felt like a palace built over someone else's pain. The morning sun crept through the curtains, painting golden lines across Mary's small apartment. She blinked awake, momentarily unsure if last night had been a dream. The events of the blind date came rushing back like waves crashing over her heart. She sat up slowly, the weight of exhaustion clinging to her. Ethan's coat still lay folded neatly beside her, clean, elegant, and out of place in her tiny home. For a long time, she just stared at it, her fingers tracing the fine stitching along the sleeve. "Why did he help me?" she whispered to herself. "People like him don't care about people like me." Her voice trembled with both confusion and disbelief. She had seen the wealthy all her life, some generous, most indifferent. But Ethan Parker had done something no one else ever did. He'd seen her pain and treated it as if it mattered. She made herself a small cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the city stir awake. Life outside went on, as it always did. Buses honking, children laughing, the distant chatter of neighbors. But inside her, something was different. She felt broken, but also strangely seen. Meanwhile, miles away in a sprawling glass mansion, Ethan stood by his office window. He hadn't slept much. The image of Mary's tearful eyes haunted him. He could still hear the sound of laughter from that restaurant. Sharp, cruel, unforgettable. He turned away from the window and sat down at his desk. In front of him lay files worth millions, contracts, business proposals, board reports, but none of it held his attention. His mind was stuck on a single thought. How many people like Mary do I pass every day without noticing? He leaned back, rubbing his temples. For the first time in years, he felt ashamed. Not because of something he'd done, but because of what he hadn't done, because he had lived in a world built on walls and wealth, where people like Mary were invisible. His assistant, Laura, entered quietly. "Sir, your morning meeting. Cancel it." Ethan interrupted softly. She blinked. "Cancel? But, sir, it's with I said cancel it." His tone wasn't angry. It was distant, thoughtful. "There are more important things today." Laura nodded, confused but obedient. As she left, Ethan opened his drawer and pulled out a small notebook. He flipped to a blank page and wrote just 4 words. She didn't deserve that. He closed the notebook, stood up, and grabbed his car keys. Mary was at work by noon, quietly dusting the hallway when she saw Ethan walk in. Her heart skipped. She hadn't expected to see him today, not after everything. "Good morning, sir," she said softly, keeping her eyes down. Ethan paused, watching her for a moment before speaking. "Mary, can we talk?" Her hands froze mid-motion. "Of course, sir." He gestured toward the garden. "Let's step outside." The two walked into the quiet backyard, sunlight filtering through the trees, the sound of birds cutting through the stillness. Ethan spoke first. "I couldn't sleep last night." Mary glanced up, startled. "Because of me?" He nodded slowly. "Because of what I saw. I've seen a lot of ugly things in business, Mary, but that was different. It made me realize something about the world I live in." Mary frowned slightly. Unsure what to say, he continued, his voice heavy with guilt. "People like me, we live in glass towers. We forget what real struggle looks like. And people like you carry the weight of this world without anyone even noticing." Mary's eyes filled with tears. "Sir, I don't want your pity." Ethan shook his head. "This isn't pity. It's an apology. You deserve to be treated with respect, not humiliated in front of strangers. Not by anyone." She looked away, biting her lip. "It's just how life is for people like me." "No," Ethan said firmly. "It's how people like me allowed it to be." There was a long silence. Then, for the first time, Mary met his eyes fully, and in that look was something powerful. A shared understanding. Ethan took a deep breath. "Mary, I want to make things right. Not just for you, but for people like you. For all the things I ignored for too long." Her lips parted in surprise. "Why me, sir?" He smiled faintly. "Because you made me see the truth, the kind of truth money can't buy." The words hung in the air like sunlight breaking through clouds. For Mary, they felt like a healing touch, not because he was a billionaire, but because he was human enough to say them. And for Ethan, it was the start of something he didn't know he was missing: redemption. The morning after the confrontation was unusually tense in the Kingston mansion. The grand house, usually humming with laughter, footsteps, and the routine rhythm of staff duties, now carried an air of unease. It felt as if every whisper bounced off the marble walls, carrying secrets that weren't meant to be heard. Maria moved quietly through the halls, her eyes puffy, her body weary from another sleepless night. She had spent hours sitting by her small apartment window, staring at the city lights, wondering if she'd still have a job in the morning. Shame clung to her like a heavy coat she couldn't take off. When she entered the kitchen, the room fell silent for a brief moment. Then, slowly, the murmurs began again. "I can't believe she was caught in the trash," one maid whispered behind a cupboard door. "I heard Mr. Kingston shouted at her," another added, lowering her voice. "He might fire her today. She always looked so proud." "Who would have thought?" someone else muttered. The words pierced Maria's heart like tiny knives. She tried to ignore them, focusing on washing dishes, scrubbing floors, anything to keep her trembling hands busy. But every glance, every half-smile, every hushed laugh reminded her of the humiliation she couldn't escape. It wasn't just gossip. It was judgment in a place where appearances mattered more than kindness. Maria had become an outsider overnight. The staff who once greeted her with warmth now avoided her eyes. Some looked at her with pity, others with disgust. She had worked in this mansion for nearly 5 years, loyal, quiet, and dependable. Yet one night had erased it all. Meanwhile, upstairs, Edward Kingston sat in his office, pretending to review documents he couldn't focus on. The image of Maria in that alley haunted him like a ghost that wouldn't fade. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her trembling hands pulling food from the trash, her tearful plea to God echoing in his mind. He'd seen poverty before, from a distance, through tinted car windows and charity reports. But this was different. This was personal. Someone under his roof was living like that at lunchtime. Edward found himself staring down at his untouched plate. He pushed it away, feeling an unfamiliar tightness in his chest. Why didn't she ask for help, he thought. Why would she let herself go hungry? Part of him was angry. Angry that she had hidden something so serious. Angry that she'd humiliated herself in a way that now cast shadows over his perfect household. But beneath that anger, there was something deeper. Guilt. By late afternoon, the whispers among the staff had grown louder. One of the senior maids, trying to curry favor, approached Edward near the dining hall. "Sir, if I may," she said softly, "I think it's best to dismiss Maria. It doesn't look good for your reputation, sir. The others are talking." Edward looked at her for a long moment, his eyes cold. "My reputation?" he repeated quietly. "Do you think that matters more than a human being's dignity?" The maid's face flushed red. She bowed quickly and hurried away. Edward leaned back in his chair, exhaling heavily. He couldn't ignore it any longer. He needed answers, real ones. He needed to know what drove a woman like Maria, humble yet proud, to such desperation. That evening, as the sun dipped below the city skyline, painting the mansion in a soft amber glow, Edward sent for her again. When Maria entered his office this time, she didn't speak. Her shoulders slumped, her eyes downcast. Edward gestured for her to sit. The tension in the air was thick. He studied her for a long moment. Her tired eyes, her trembling fingers, the quiet dignity she somehow still carried despite the humiliation. Finally, he spoke, his voice softer than before. "Maria, tell me the truth. I want to understand." Maria's lips trembled, and she nodded slowly. The secret she had been carrying for years was about to come to light, and neither of them would ever be the same again. The air inside Edward Kingston's office was heavy with silence. The grand room, filled with books, expensive art, and trophies of success, suddenly felt smaller, as if even the walls were listening. Maria stood at the doorway, clutching the edge of her apron, her breath trembling. Edward gestured for her to sit, his eyes softer now, but still searching for answers. "Please," he said quietly. "Sit down, Maria." She hesitated for a moment before taking the chair across from him. The table between them felt like a wall, a barrier of class, of privilege, of pain neither of them fully understood yet. Edward leaned forward, folding his hands. "I'm not here to scold you. I just want to understand," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Why were you eating from the trash?" Maria lowered her gaze, her fingers twisting the fabric of her apron. "Because, sir," she whispered, "I didn't have a choice." Edward frowned. "You get paid well. You live here, you eat here. What do you mean you didn't have a choice?" Her shoulders began to shake as tears welled in her eyes. "I send every penny I earn back home, sir. To my son." Edward's brows furrowed. "Your son?" She nodded slowly, wiping her tears. "Yes, sir. His name is Daniel. He's only 8. He was born with a heart condition. The doctors said he needed surgery before he turns 9, or he won't survive." Edward's chest tightened. He hadn't known she even had a child. She had never spoken of family, never asked for special favors. He had always thought she was just quiet, not broken. Maria continued, her voice trembling. "I came to this country to work, to save for his treatment. But everything here is expensive: rent, medicine, hospital bills. I couldn't afford both food and hope. So I sent all my money home. Every week." Her words hung in the air, sharp and heavy. Edward sat back, speechless. For years, he had been surrounded by people who pretended, who smiled for advantage, who chased wealth as he did. And yet, in front of him sat a woman who worked 12-hour days, cleaning his home, starving silently, all to save her child. That Maria's hands trembled as she reached into her apron pocket. From it, she pulled a small, wrinkled photograph, the edges frayed, the surface faded from time. "This is him," she whispered. Edward took the photo gently. It showed a thin boy with big, bright eyes and a shy smile, lying on a hospital bed. His small chest was covered with medical tape, his hand clutching a toy car. "That's Daniel?" Edward asked softly. Maria nodded. "He loves cars," she said weakly, smiling through tears. "He says one day he'll build one for me. But he hasn't even seen me in over a year. I just send him letters and money when I can." Edward looked at her, guilt clawing at his heart. The night before, he had judged her, assumed the worst, without ever asking why. Now, sitting across from her, he realized how blind he'd been. "How long have you been going hungry like this?" he asked quietly. Maria hesitated before answering, her voice barely audible. "Almost 6 months now. I only eat what's left after everyone's dinner. And sometimes, when there's nothing left, I look in the bins." A lump formed in Edward's throat. The image of her kneeling beside that trash bin replayed in his mind. Only this time, he saw it differently. Not as disgrace, but as sacrifice. He leaned forward, his voice low but sincere. "Maria, you should have told me. You shouldn't have to live like this." Maria shook her head. "I didn't want pity, sir. I just wanted to save my son." For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence between them wasn't cold anymore. It was heavy with truth. Edward finally broke it, his voice softer than it had ever been. "Maria, tomorrow, we're going to see your son." Her eyes widened in shock. "What? You heard me," he said firmly. "You've carried this pain alone for too long. Let me help." Maria covered her face, sobbing silently. She had spent years hiding her suffering, and now, for the first time, someone saw her, really saw her. And in that moment, Edward Kingston, a man who had everything, realized that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in compassion. The office was silent except for the faint ticking of the golden clock on the wall. Outside, the evening sun painted the sky in shades of orange and crimson, but inside, Maria's world felt small, filled only with the echoes of her own pain. Edward sat across from her, his usually confident face softened by shock and guilt. He couldn't look away from the photo of the little boy lying in that hospital bed, Daniel, a child he'd never met, but whose fragile smile had just pierced his heart. Maria took a shaky breath. "Sir," she whispered, her voice raw from crying, "I've done everything I can. I've taken extra shifts, cleaned other houses at night, but it's never enough. Every week, the hospital sends new bills, and I can't keep up." Edward leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. "Doesn't his father help?" Her lips trembled, and she shook her head. "He left when Daniel was 2. Said he couldn't handle the medical expenses. Since then, it's just been me. I promised my boy I'd never give up on him." Tears rolled down her cheeks as she spoke, her hands trembling. "Some nights, I work so late that I forget to eat. But when I close my eyes, I see his face. I see him fighting to breathe, holding his little toy car, saying, 'Mama, I'm strong, see? I'll be okay.'" She paused, trying to hold back sobs. "He doesn't know I haven't eaten properly in weeks. He doesn't know that sometimes I go hungry, so I can send him the money for medicine. He thinks I'm living a good life in the city." Edward's throat tightened. He had heard stories of poverty before, on television, in charity campaigns, in glossy reports his company sponsored, but never this close, never this real. Maria continued, her eyes staring into the distance as if replaying memories that haunted her. "There was one night," she said softly, "when Daniel called me crying. He said his chest hurt and he couldn't breathe. I could hear the machines beeping behind him. I wanted to run to him, but I couldn't. I didn't even have enough money for a bus ticket." Her voice broke completely then. "Do you know what it's like, sir, to hear your child gasping for air and you can't hold him? You can't be there to tell him it'll be okay." Edward swallowed hard, his eyes glistening. "No," he whispered, "I don't." Maria wiped her face with the edge of her sleeve. "That's why I don't waste a single dollar. Every cent I make goes to him. I sleep on the floor, I eat what's left, and when there's nothing left," she paused, ashamed, "I look in the trash. I tell myself, it's just food. It doesn't matter where it comes from, as long as Daniel can live." Edward felt a deep ache in his chest. In that moment, he wasn't a billionaire. He wasn't a powerful man surrounded by wealth. He was just a witness to a mother's courage, to her silent battle. He whispered softly, almost to himself, "You've been starving to keep your child alive." Maria nodded. "A mother's hunger is nothing compared to a child's pain," she said through tears. "If I have to suffer so my son can smile, then so be it." Edward leaned back, overwhelmed. He realized that all his success, all his possessions, meant nothing if he couldn't understand the value of sacrifice. For years, he believed he knew what strength looked like. Men in suits, powerful deals, winning at all costs. But now, he saw it in front of him. In a poor, exhausted maid with blistered hands and an unbreakable heart. That he took a deep breath. "Maria," he said gently, "you've carried this pain alone for too long. Let me help. Let me see your son." She looked up, startled. "You don't have to. I want to," Edward interrupted. "No child should suffer like that. Not while I can do something." For a long moment, Maria just stared at him, unsure if she should believe what she was hearing. And then, for the first time in years, a flicker of hope crossed her tear-streaked face. The following morning arrived gray and quiet. For once, the Kingston mansion did not buzz with its usual rhythm of footsteps and chatter. The air felt heavy, almost as if the house itself sensed that something important was about to happen. Maria stood near the servants' entrance, clutching a worn purse to her chest. Her heart raced. She still couldn't believe what Mr. Kingston had said the night before. "We're going to see your son." For hours she had prayed it wasn't just pity, but a promise he truly meant. When Edward appeared, dressed simply in a charcoal coat instead of his usual tailored suit, Maria's eyes widened. "Sir, are you sure you want to come? The hospital isn't like what you're used to," she said nervously. He offered a faint smile. "I'm sure, Maria. Lead the way." They drove in silence through the city. The tall glass buildings slowly gave way to cracked sidewalks, faded billboards, and rows of crumbling apartments. Edward stared out the window, seeing a side of the city he'd never bothered to look at. He had owned skyscrapers here, but he had never truly seen its people. After nearly an hour, they stopped in front of a small public hospital. The paint on the walls was peeling, and the sign above the gate flickered weakly. Maria stepped out first, gripping her purse as if it carried her whole world. Edward followed, adjusting his coat, his polished shoes now stepping onto a pavement stained with years of rain and neglect. Inside, the corridors smelled faintly of antiseptic and dust. Nurses hurried past, carrying charts and medicine trays. Somewhere, a child coughed. Somewhere else, a heart monitor beeped in steady rhythm. Edward's expression softened. He had walked through luxury clinics before, quiet, polished places that smelled of money. But this was different. This was survival. Maria led him through the narrow hallways until they reached Ward 12. She stopped at the doorway and whispered, "He's inside." Edward followed her gaze and froze that on the far bed, under thin white sheets, lay a small boy. His skin was pale, his frame thin, his chest rising and falling with effort. Yet when he saw his mother, his tired eyes lit up like dawn. "Mama," he said, his voice weak but full of joy. Maria rushed to his side, tears already streaming down her face. She knelt beside the bed and kissed his forehead. "My Daniel," she whispered, "Mama's here." The boy's small hand reached out and touched her cheek. "I told Nurse you'd come. I prayed last night." Edward stood a few steps away, watching quietly. Something inside him broke. This frail little boy, smiling despite pain, believing despite fear, was the reason Maria had starved herself. Daniel looked at him curiously. "Mama, who's the man?" Maria wiped her eyes. "This is my boss, Mr. Kingston. He wanted to meet you." Edward knelt down slowly, so his eyes were level with Daniel's. "Hi, champ," he said softly. "Your mom tells me you love cars." Daniel's face brightened. "Yes, when I get better, I'm going to build one that flies." Edward chuckled, though his throat felt tight. "Then I'll be your first customer." For the next few minutes, he listened as Daniel spoke about toy cars, cartoons, and the hospital cat that sometimes wandered into the ward. Each word was fragile, yet filled with hope. Edward felt something he hadn't felt in years. Humility, warmth, humanity. When Daniel grew tired, Maria tucked him in gently. She turned to Edward, whispering, "This is his life now, sir. Machines, medicine, and waiting." Edward's jaw clenched. "Not anymore," he said quietly. He deserves a chance. Both of you do. Maria looked at him, confused, but before she could speak, Edward gently placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. We'll talk tomorrow, he said. But I promise you, Maria, this boy will get the help he needs. As they walked out of the ward, Maria glanced back at her son. Daniel was already asleep, smiling faintly. For the first time in years, her heart didn't ache with fear. It fluttered with something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. That night, Edward Kingston could not sleep. The mansion was quiet, but his mind wasn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the image of Daniel, the boy's frail body, his soft voice, his bright, unbroken smile despite the pain. It haunted him when he got out of bed and walked toward the large glass window overlooking his city. Below, the lights sparkled like jewels scattered across the darkness. He had built much of this city. His name was engraved on towers, his wealth measured in billions. Yet at that moment, none of it felt like success. It all felt empty. Edward poured himself a glass of water and sat down. For years, he had lived believing that money was the answer to everything. But Maria's story had cracked that illusion wide open. How could a woman who worked for him, who scrubbed his floors and cleaned his silver plates, be so loyal, so selfless? How could she starve herself, not out of despair, but out of love for her child? He remembered the way Maria had kissed her son's forehead, whispering prayers as though her words could heal him. That sight had moved something deep inside Edward, something that no amount of money had ever touched. For the first time in his adult life, the billionaire felt small. The next morning, Edward arrived at his office early. His assistant, Mr. Collins, was surprised. "Sir, you're here before sunrise," he said. Edward gave a faint smile. "I have something important to do today." He called his private secretary and began making phone calls to doctors, hospitals, foundations, and lawyers. His instructions were simple but firm. Find the best pediatric specialists in the country. Make arrangements for immediate transfer. And make sure the mother is taken care of. Toot by noon. Everything was set in motion. Edward leaned back in his chair, staring at the paperwork before him. His signature on those documents meant more than just money. It meant change. It meant hope for a boy who had none. Later that day, he visited the hospital again. When Maria saw him, her eyes widened in shock. "Mr. Kingston? You came back." He smiled. "I made a promise to your son, Maria, and I intend to keep it." She looked at him, unsure what he meant. Edward motioned for her to sit. "Maria," he said gently, "Daniel doesn't belong here. He needs specialized care, something this hospital can't provide. I've arranged for him to be moved to the best children's hospital in the country. All expenses will be covered. And when he recovers, I want you to know, you'll never have to worry about food or shelter again." Maria's lips trembled. "Sir, why would you do this for us?" Edward took a deep breath. "Because yesterday, I realized I've been blind. I've seen poverty from behind tinted car windows, but I never felt it until I saw you. You didn't just work for me. You reminded me what humanity looks like." Tears streamed down Maria's cheeks as she whispered, "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to," he said softly. "Just take care of Daniel. That's all the thanks I need." That night, as Daniel was moved to the private hospital, Maria followed closely behind the ambulance, holding her son's hand through the open window. Edward stood by, watching them drive away, his reflection flickering in the ambulance lights. For once, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. It wasn't charity. It wasn't guilt. It was a promise kept, not in words, but in action. As the ambulance disappeared down the road, Edward whispered to himself, "No one under my roof will ever go hungry again." It was a silent vow, but one that would change all their lives forever. The transfer to the new hospital was like stepping into another world. Bright, clean halls gleamed under soft lights. Nurses smiled warmly as Maria and Daniel were wheeled in. Machines hummed quietly, and the air carried the faint scent of fresh linen, not the sharp sting of antiseptic and decay that lingered in the old ward. Maria held Daniel's hand tightly as doctors in crisp white coats gathered around, checking charts and murmuring to each other. She had never seen so many people care about her son all at once. For years, she had begged hospitals for help, only to be turned away because she couldn't pay. Now, for the first time, doors opened. All because one man had cared enough to make a call. From the observation window, Edward Kingston watched quietly. He didn't want Maria to feel like he was hovering, but he couldn't look away. Something about the little boy reminded him of his own childhood. Lonely, fragile, overshadowed by a father who cared more about profits than people. That Daniel's treatment began immediately. Days turned into weeks, and the transformation was slow but undeniable. The boy's color returned. His breathing grew stronger. The spark in his eyes, that same bright light Edward had seen in the hospital bed, shone brighter each day. Maria stayed by his side day and night. Sometimes she prayed softly, sometimes she just smiled, whispering stories about angels and second chances. Every so often, Edward would visit, bringing toys, books, and little surprises. Each time, Daniel's eyes would light up. One afternoon, as Edward entered the room, he found Daniel sitting up, laughing as a nurse fed him pudding. "Well, look who's awake and stealing desserts," Edward teased. Daniel giggled. "Mr. Kingston, the doctor says I might go home soon." Edward's chest tightened with joy. "That's the best news I've heard all year." Maria, standing beside the bed, looked at him with tears in her eyes. "Sir, there's no way I can ever repay you for this." Edward shook his head gently. "Maria, you already have. You reminded me what kindness looks like. You reminded me that money means nothing if it doesn't touch someone's life." Her lips quivered, and she turned away before her emotions spilled over. In the following weeks, Edward's visits became more frequent. Sometimes he brought lunch for Maria. Other times he simply sat and talked with Daniel about cars, stars, and the silly dreams children have. It was as if the billionaire had found something he didn't know he was missing. Connection. One evening, when the sunset painted golden rays across the hospital walls, Daniel asked, "Mr. Kingston, why did you help me?" Edward smiled softly. "Because your mother once worked for me, and I failed to see her pain. Helping you was the least I could do to make it right." Daniel tilted his head. "Mama says you're a good man now." Edward chuckled, though his throat tightened. "Your mama is too kind, but I'm trying." Maria stood silently, listening. She could see that this wasn't just about charity anymore. Edward's heart had changed. The man who once cared only for money now cared for people, for them. When the doctors finally declared Daniel healthy enough to leave, the entire ward celebrated. The nurses clapped, the doctors smiled, and Maria hugged her son tightly, tears of joy streaming down her face. Edward watched from the doorway, his heart swelling with emotion. He had written countless checks in his life, but this moment of pure happiness, was worth more than every deal he had ever made. Daniel ran toward him, wrapping his small arms around Edward's leg. The billionaire bent down and whispered, "You're a strong boy, Daniel. You're the real miracle here." Daniel smiled up at him. "No, Mr. Kingston, you're the miracle." Edward froze, emotion flooding through him. For the first time in his life, he felt truly seen. And in that golden hospital hallway, filled with laughter and light, Edward Kingston realized something that would stay with him forever. Wealth wasn't measured in what you kept. It was measured in what you gave away. Weeks after Daniel's recovery, life began to return to its rhythm. But for Edward Kingston, nothing was the same anymore. The once cold, towering mansion no longer felt like a home built for one man's ego. He started noticing things he'd ignored for years. The way the morning light spilled through the curtains, the smell of coffee from the kitchen, the quiet laughter of his staff. For the first time, he saw them not as employees, but as people. People with stories, dreams, and families of their own. Everywhere he looked, Edward felt Maria's presence, not physically, but through the lesson she had unknowingly carved into his heart. He couldn't stop thinking about that night he had found her behind his mansion, eating leftovers from the trash. The image once filled him with discomfort. Now it filled him with guilt and reflection. How many others lived like that, unseen, unhelped, unheard? One morning, he called a meeting with his company board. His executives sat around the long table, staring in confusion as Edward entered, not in his usual designer suit, but in a simple shirt and rolled-up sleeves. "Gentlemen," he began, "we've built an empire. But we've forgotten what it means to be human." "I've forgotten." The room went silent. "I want to start something new, a foundation," he continued, "one that helps families like Maria's." single parents, sick children, people who work hard but still go hungry. I don't just want to give money. I want to give them a chance. The executives exchanged surprised glances, unsure if their billionaire boss had lost his mind. But Edward's tone was firm, calm, and filled with a conviction they hadn't heard before. From today, he said, the Kingston Foundation will be our legacy. Not profits, not numbers, but lives changed. Over the next months, Edward's world transformed completely. He began visiting orphanages, hospitals, and shelters, not for publicity, but for understanding. Cameras were banned. He didn't want fame. He wanted connection. Maria, now officially retired from her maid's job, became one of the foundation's first coordinators. She helped organize care programs for single mothers and underprivileged children. Edward insisted she take a leadership role. After all, she knew what it meant to fight with nothing but faith. Every Friday, Daniel visited Edward's mansion for lunch. They'd sit together in the garden, Edward reading stories, Daniel showing his latest toy car designs. The boys' laughter filled the air like sunlight, breaking the silence that had once haunted those halls. One afternoon, Daniel asked innocently, "Mr. Kingston, are you lonely?" Edward smiled softly. "Not anymore, son. I used to have everything but feel empty. Now I have little moments like this, and they mean everything." Maria watched from the terrace, her heart swelling with gratitude. She knew God had used her pain to soften a heart of stone, but what she didn't know was that Edward had rewritten his will. He had set aside a large portion of his fortune for Daniel's education and the foundation's future, ensuring their work would continue long after he was gone. Late one evening, as Edward sat in his study, he opened his journal and wrote, "Once I measured wealth in gold. Now I measure it in smiles. Once I built walls to keep the world out. Now I build doors to let people in." He closed the book, tears glistening in his eyes. For the first time in decades, he felt light, not because of what he had gained, but because of what he had given away to eye in the quiet of his vast home. Edward Kingston, the billionaire who once lived only for himself, finally found what no fortune could ever buy: peace, purpose, and a heart reborn. Years passed, and the seasons changed over the Kingston estate. The mansion, once cold and silent, was now full of laughter, music, and the sound of children running through its gardens. What had once been a place of pride had turned into a place of purpose. The Kingston Foundation had grown beyond anyone's imagination. It started with one boy's hospital bed and one mother's tears, but it spread like light through darkness. Now, there were shelters, schools, and free clinics all across the city, each one carrying the symbol of hope that Edward Kingston had built from his pain and redemption. Maria became one of its most beloved figures. Her humility, her strength, and her faith touched every person who met her. People would often ask her, "How did all this begin?" And she would smile gently, saying, "With a piece of bread and a kind heart that decided to see." As for Daniel, he grew up healthy, full of dreams. His love for cars turned into a passion for engineering. By the time he was 16, he had already won several science competitions and earned a scholarship through the foundation that bore Edward's name. Every success he had, every smile he gave, was a living echo of the kindness that had once saved his life. But time, as it always does, moved on. One winter morning, Maria received a call from the Kingston mansion. Edward had fallen ill. He was old now, his hair silver, his once commanding voice now gentle and frail. Still, when Maria entered his room, he smiled at her with the same warmth that had changed her world years ago. "Maria," he whispered, "look how far we've come." Her eyes filled with tears as she took his hand. "Sir, you gave us everything. You changed our lives." Edward shook his head slowly. "No, you changed mine. You showed me that love is the only thing worth living for." Daniel, now a tall young man, stood beside them. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver toy car, the very same one Edward had given him years ago during his hospital days. "I kept it all these years," Daniel said softly. "It reminds me that miracles are real." Edward smiled faintly. "You were the miracle, Daniel. You and your mother." Tears streamed down Maria's face as she whispered, "Thank you, Mr. Kingston, for seeing us when no one else did." With a gentle squeeze of her hand, Edward murmured, Promise me you'll keep the foundation alive. Promise me it'll keep helping those who have no one." Maria nodded firmly, her voice breaking. "I promise." Edward's eyes closed slowly, a peaceful smile on his face. "Good, then I can rest." The room grew silent except for the soft ticking of the clock. A few moments later, the billionaire who once lived in loneliness took his final breath, surrounded not by luxury, but by love. Days later, thousands attended his memorial. The city he had once ruled with business deals now mourned him with gratitude. Portraits of him and Maria stood side by side at the entrance of the Kingston Foundation headquarters, symbolizing not wealth and power, but compassion and humanity. Years rolled on, and the foundation expanded across the country. Hospitals, schools, orphanages, all carried a simple quote engraved beneath Edward's name. "Kindness is the greatest investment, for it always returns, multiplied." Daniel eventually took over the foundation, fulfilling the promise his mother made. Every project he led, every child he helped, was his way of saying thank you to the man who had believed in him. And every evening, before locking his office, Daniel would look at the framed photo on his desk, one of a smiling Edward Kingston, standing beside a younger Daniel and Maria, and whisper, "You're still here, sir. Your legacy lives on." The camera would fade on that image, the light of sunset glinting off the silver toy car, as a soft voice narrates. He found her eating from the trash, but what he truly found was his own heart, because sometimes the poorest among us have the richest souls, and one act of kindness can change the world forever.